So what we're going to do next is look at a numerical example, right? We haven't talked about the rate servo loop yet, but just for now, assume I have a rate servo loop. So if I command this history of gimbal rates, very similar to reaction wheel speeds, we're going to have a loop here. I'll show you how to derive it. It's very similar. It's always these first order Lyapunov functions, things you practice in homework 1. How do we do that? So here's a spacecraft, initial attitudes. I have 4 wheels. I have a variety of angles, things I'm giving, gimbal angles, gimbal rates, just how it's all configured. All the numbers are there. And then there's 2 things I'm doing to deal with the robustness. This is the Nakamura and Hanafusa modification, where also alpha gets scaled by a singularity index, and you could throw in a mu if you wanted to, but to some singularity measure. So near that, we add this alpha, and away from the gimbal lock, we let it asymptotically go to 0 very sharply. And we just go back to resuming our regular control. So that gets rid of some issues there, but you can still have singularities that drive you, even with this modification, into this locked configuration where you don't come out. There's things called escapable singularities and inescapable singularities. So there's papers on that, and for the inescapable singularities, there's modifications to the feedback gains that can be introduced. So there's an orthogonality index that was done, and this is in a paper by O and Vadali back in 1991. But they did some really nice work. If you wanted to study up on somebody else's papers and redo this, O and Vadali did some work that's very relevant to this class, and it might be good to look at. They did some really cool pioneering work on CMG control. And this is the modification. So in essence, we changed the feedback control that we were dealing with depending on this. And it's not explicitly time dependent, it's state dependent on how this works. And we have either these terms that we put in off the axes or not, or if it's beta, we just brute force making it go to 0 outside of some index. And in essence, we're changing the control all of a sudden on the rate damping, and that allows us to avoid a lot of these other issues. So I'm really trying to do a good one that shouldn't have such problems. And then we'll see what the response is of a CMG control versus if you just do a variable speed CMG, when we can go around it. Now, the example I'm picking is not just by random. I'm picking an example that will be particularly challenging. I think it came from their paper, actually, to illustrate this, why the regular controls have such problems, and it gets there. So even with these modifications, we're going to look at this, and let's look at the determinant. And that's the determinant of the D1 matrix. It's basically, it's dominated by all the GT axes, right? If that determinant goes to 0, my CMG has reached a gimbal lock kind of configuration, and I can only do torques in the plane, not outside. And you can see at the beginning we are at 0. That's not good. So then as we maneuver, the CMG control does get outside, but then it resumes again at 0. And the orthogonality index that's in that paper too, you can see the classic CMGs is not at 0 orthogonality. That's a bad thing. But it does get there afterwards. It gets recaptured into that and never escapes it. So even with this modification on the feedback gain P, it helps, but it doesn't guarantee always. So this was a case, a particularly challenging case of doing an attitude maneuver where you hit that and you get there. Versus if we're doing VSCMGs, I'm just showing you for reference, I'm still showing you the determinant of the D1 part of the D matrix to go, hey, with gimbal rates, yes, we had a singularity and we do improve, but go there, but then it goes back up. But of course, we don't rely only on gimbal rates to produce our torque. We also have the other ones. So these singularities aren't really singularities for the VSCMGs. It just shows you when does your CMG subcomponent go singular, but I still have reaction wheel components. Question?
Why does the diverge around 20 seconds? Why don't they just stay full stay 0 and then the torque comes around?
Well, what's happening is the VSCMGs is changing its wheel speeds, and it changes the complete momentum envelope of the system. And then therefore, it's a completely different system at that point. Gimbal angles have diverged enough from between the two controls that this doesn't hit those CMG singularities anymore. We started out with the same conditions, but then it's the same physical system, but I'm driving it 2 different ways. And with the VSCMG, we just continue to work and we get past it. We just brute force literally get past these singularities by using reaction wheel torques to augment the system as needed. And then we resume with CMGs right afterwards. So you will see this in the next few plots, how this plans out. This is just the indices that I want to show. This is a really challenging maneuver. This doesn't happen you have to really hunt and find something like this, Otherwise, they wouldn't have those flights. I believe so. Yes, this is a rest-to-rest reorientation. Let me see. No, we did have a tumble to begin with. There is an angular rate there, and then an attitude. I forget. I think we're just stabilizing this attitude, so it's a motion to rest, a regulation problem. Bring it to rest, I believe. Yeah. And then you hit a singularity, and at the beginning we've configured the wheels and gimbals such that we're already at a singularity to begin with, and we rediscover it again. We just don't escape it. So if we look at the attitude history, we start out at the same orientations. Solid lines are the VSCMGs, dashed are the CMGs, and you can see we kind of start to stabilize. This starts to come way down, this gets slightly bigger, but then starts to come down, and there's others that are kind of overlapping with the solid lines. So when we're at a singularity, we get away from it for a brief moment, and then things get really bad because the orthogonality index goes to 0. And what happens here is you can see our VSCMG always produces the required torque. And so this system is able to stabilize the way we would expect. Versus the other system, even with all these modifications, it really struggles. It does start to converge and get there, but once it hits these conditions, and then this kicks in, it's getting there, but it's taking a long, long, long time with these classic CMG robustness modifications to work with these gimbal locks and working around. This is a pretty extreme case, but it's kind of illustrative. So we always get the required torques, and we will converge the way we want. But of course, as always, it comes at a price. The angular velocities, similarly, we start out with the same rates, but we will settle. These other ones actually look slower, quicker, just because it's not moving. It's not like we're converging faster, it's just like it's taking longer now to slowly creep there. That's why our angular rates look like they have less tracking error with the CMG. That's just because they're not doing very much. And eventually everything has to come to 0. So that's that. If we look at the gimbal angles, we had the same gimbal angles and we start similarly. That means we were using the VSCMGs kind of like CMGs at the beginning as much as possible. But then when we came out of that, there was that spiking thing, and then the determinant went to 0 again. We really start to use the reaction wheel modes in conjunction with the CMGs, and that's where these states completely start to divert. It's just a very different VSCMG configuration. And so that's what's happening here. And then the other ones are there, but again, it's not using much CMG. It is changing with time. That was that slow final convergence. It is kinda, but it's not doing much. The effort gimbal angle rates, the gimbling that we do, it looks quite different quickly, but then it kind of converges, and up to that 20-second, then our VSCMGs does gimbal again. So you can see where the other one just stays locked in that singularity. The VSCMG is able to drive past it and use CMG modes again to do the final capture and get us there. Henry.
Have you done a similar analysis with an extra gimbal axis?
A double gimbaled? I had a student, Don Stevenson, who wrote a whole paper. That was his project in this class, and it turned into a journal paper on looking at a double gimbaled version of this. It's just even more math and to do it. But then you have two sets of gimbal angles, and they cross-couple because one gimbaling is based on the other, so it gets a lot more complicated. Yeah, but you will find paper. There's also some papers from Japan that's been looking at double gimbaled. One of them came over, one of the researchers, and was a visiting scholar in my lab, and wrote some stuff on this stuff too. So there's been some work on double gimbaled, but nothing as much as the single gimbaled systems. Okay, so you can see the performance difference. And now the big difference is going to be wheel speeds. Let's jump here. With the CMG mode, our motor torque equation just is used to hold my wheel speed constant. And that's it. And you can see the wheel speeds being held constant all the time. Whereas they were going about 14 point something radians per second, And at the beginning, we started out on a singularity. You remember, we were at a gimbal lock. So we could produce some of the torque with that's in the plane, but the part that was out of the GT plane had to be produced with wheels, and that causes the first bump in speeds. And we got past that. The singularity, the determinant went non-zero, and our wheel speeds are held almost constant. And then we hit that really nasty singularity that CMG had so much trouble recovering from. And here we just brute force muscle through it. And notice the time scale. This is only up to 20. So that was happening here earlier. But that's where we get the big variations. Beyond that, we no longer hit it, and we basically just have constant wheel speeds. But we're going from 14 almost up to 26, almost a factor of 2 increase in our wheel speeds. So this is a pretty drastic change in wheel speeds that would require some significant torques. So this is a difference between required torque, that's what we're supposed to be producing, and what we actually produced with the CMGs. And you can see we get there at the beginning, but then with these singularities, we don't get close to the required torque because we end up in a, this gimbal lock. The control keeps saying torque here, and it's like, all I can give you is this plane, and I'm slightly off because of those P modifications, but only slightly, and you're kind of inching your ways towards it, making that happen.